Every pattern you repeat or every choice you can't explain and every version of yourself you keep returning to has a blueprint. Welcome to the Echo Principle, where we map the unseen architecture of human behavior. If you think carefully, you belong here, so drop a like and make sure to subscribe to our channel. There is a study where people were asked to fold origami animals. Simple ones. Cranes, frogs, basic shapes that most people with no origami experience produce at a level that is, to put it kindly, unremarkable. And then those people were asked how much they would pay for their own creation. And separately, how much they would pay for the same origami shape made by an expert. The people who had folded the origami valued their own clumsy, asymmetrical, amateur creation at nearly the same level as the expert's work. Outside observers, people who had not made anything, valued the amateur origami at a fraction of what the creators did. The creators were not joking. They were not being polite. They genuinely believed their origami was worth more than it was. They had spent effort on it, and that effort had attached itself to the object like a price tag that only they could see. This is the IKEA effect. A cognitive bias so embedded in the way human beings relate to their own labor that it shapes everything from the furniture in your living room to the businesses people refuse to abandon, the relationships people stay in too long, and the ideas people defend past the point where defense makes any sense. The researchers who named it, Michael Norton, Daniel Mochon, and Dan Ariely, published their findings in 2011. And what they found was not subtle. Norton, Mochon, and Ariely named the effect after IKEA specifically because IKEA furniture is one of the most visible and universally recognizable examples of the phenomenon in everyday life. When you buy a fully assembled piece of furniture, you have an object. When you buy an IKEA flat pack and spend 2 hours assembling it, you have an object and a story. You have effort, and frustration, and the specific satisfaction of a thing that now exists because you made it exist. And that story inflates the value of the object in your mind in a way that is measurable, consistent, and entirely invisible to you while it is happening. The study measured this directly. Participants who assembled IKEA boxes themselves reported significantly higher valuations for those boxes than participants who received the same boxes pre-assembled. Same object. Same material. Same function. Different labor input. Completely different perceived value. And when the researchers pushed further, they found something even more interesting. The effect only held when the task was completed. Participants who were interrupted before finishing their assembly did not show elevated valuations. The effort had to result in completion. The investment had to reach its conclusion. A half-built thing did not produce the same attachment as a finished one. Which tells you something important about what the brain is actually tracking. To understand why completion matters, you have to understand what the brain is doing when it assigns value to an object. Standard economic theory has a straightforward answer to this. Objects are worth what people are willing to pay for them, and what people are willing to pay is determined by the object's utility. Its function, its quality, its scarcity. Labor is an input in production, not a component of value in the consumer's hands. But this is not how human beings actually process value. Human beings are not utility calculators. They are meaning makers. And meaning attaches to objects through the stories and efforts and emotions that become associated with them. The anthropologist Sherry Turkle wrote about what she called evocative objects, things that think, objects that carry cognitive and emotional weight beyond their physical function. A mug is not just a mug when your child made it. A chair is not just a chair when you built it yourself. The physical object becomes a container for something that has nothing to do with its material properties. And the brain, which is exquisitely sensitive to effort and investment, registers that container as more valuable than an equivalent object that carries no such weight. This is not irrationality in the pejorative sense. It is the brain doing something that in most contexts is extremely useful. The useful function this serves goes back further than Norton and Ariely's 2011 paper. The psychological foundation of the IKEA effect sits on top of two older theoretical structures. The first is Leon Festinger's cognitive dissonance theory, which we have touched on in other contexts, but which applies here in a specific and important way. When you invest significant effort into something, you create a psychological commitment to that thing. And if the thing turns out to be mediocre, you are faced with a dissonance. You worked hard, and what you produced is not very good. That is an uncomfortable combination of facts to hold simultaneously. The mind resolves this discomfort not by honestly evaluating the quality of the output, but by inflating the perceived quality of the output. You worked hard, therefore it must be good. The effort becomes evidence of value. The second theoretical structure is Robert White's Effectance theory from 1959. White argued that human beings have a fundamental intrinsic motivation to affect their environment, to act on the world and produce change. This drive, which White called effectance motivation, is not about reward. It is about the experience of competence and agency, the satisfaction of having caused something to exist or change. The IKEA effect is, in part, an expression of effectance motivation finding its reflection in the finished object. Mochon, Norton, and Ariely ran a series of studies to test the boundaries of the effect, to find out where it held and where it broke down. One of the most revealing findings was about the role of perceived competence. The effect was strongest when participants felt that they had done the task reasonably well. When participants were made to feel that their assembly was poor, that they had done it wrong or inefficiently, the elevated valuation largely disappeared. Which means the IKEA effect is not simply about effort. It is about effort that produces something the person can claim, a competent signal that they can attach their identity to. This is a critical distinction, because it means the bias is not a blanket endorsement of everything you have worked hard on. It is specifically about the intersection of effort and perceived success. The things you worked hard on and feel you executed reasonably well. Those are the things your brain will overvalue. Those are the things you will defend past the point of rationality. Those are the things you will refuse to abandon even when the evidence for abandoning them is clear. The entrepreneur who has sunk 2 years into a failing business and keeps going not because the business has merit but because the investment has become identity. The writer who cannot see that the chapter needs to be cut because they spent a week on it. The cook who serves guests a mediocre dish with complete confidence because they made it. The IKEA effect also interacts with another well-documented cognitive bias called the sunk cost fallacy. The sunk cost fallacy is the tendency to continue investing in something because of resources already committed to it, rather than because of its future prospects. The classic example is sitting through a terrible film because you paid for the ticket. The money is gone whether you stay or leave. Rational analysis says leave. But the brain says you have already invested, so you should see it through. The IKEA effect adds a layer on top of this. It is not just that you have invested resources you do not want to waste. It is that the investment has transformed your perception of the object itself. The film is not just something you paid for. It is something you chose, and your brain has quietly elevated its perceived quality to justify the choice. The two biases compound each other in ways that can be genuinely difficult to untangle from the inside. You are not just unwilling to walk away from a bad investment. You are increasingly unable to see that the investment is bad, because every hour you put in adds another layer of perceived value. The object, the project, the relationship, the belief, becomes more precious to you the more you pour into it. Not because it is getting better, because you are getting more committed. There is a version of this that plays out at enormous scale in the history of military and political decision-making. The escalation of commitment, sometimes called the Vietnam effect in the decision science literature, describes the documented tendency of leaders and institutions to increase investment in failing strategies precisely because of prior investment. The more a government has spent on a war, the harder it becomes to perceive the war as unwinnable. The more a corporation has invested in a failing product line, the harder it becomes for internal decision makers to see the product line clearly. This is the IKEA effect operating at institutional scale. The labor is not physical assembly. It is years of policy, billions of dollars, thousands of decisions made by real people who stake their reputations on the strategy. And the brain, at every level of that institution, is performing the same inflation that the origami folders performed in the laboratory. We built this. Therefore it has value. The alternative is not just that the strategy is wrong. The alternative is that everything we invested in it was wrong. And that is not just an economic loss. That is an identity threat. The mind does not go there willingly. Dan Ariely, whose broader work on irrational decision-making is some of the most widely read behavioral economics research of the last 2 decades, situates the IKEA effect within a larger argument about the relationship between labor and love. Ariely argues that labor does not just add economic value to objects in the mind of the maker. It adds something closer to emotional ownership. A felt sense of authorship and connection that changes the nature of the relationship between person and object. He draws a parallel to parenting. Parents, he notes, are famously unable to assess their children objectively. They consistently rate their children as more talented, more attractive, and more exceptional than outside observers do. And this is not simply bias in the negative sense. It is the product of investment, of the enormous labor and attention and sacrifice that parenting requires. The love and the labor are inseparable. And the result is a valuation that no objective measure could produce or justify. The IKEA effect is, Ariely suggests, a miniature version of this. You fold the origami, and for a moment the origami is yours in the way that very few things are yours. And your brain, which knows the difference between yours and not yours, prices it accordingly. The practical implications of understanding the IKEA effect are significant and slightly uncomfortable to sit with. Because what the research is describing is a systematic distortion in your ability to evaluate the things you have made or built or invested in. Not an occasional distortion. A consistent, predictable, measurable one. This means that your assessment of your own work is almost certainly inflated relative to how others see it. Not because you are arrogant. Not because you lack self-awareness. But because the very act of making something changes how you see it, and there is no internal signal that tells you this is happening. You experience your elevated valuation as an accurate assessment. The origami folders did not feel biased. They felt like they were simply reporting what the origami was worth. And they were wrong, in a direction that the effort itself had determined before they even looked up from the table. Knowing this does not automatically correct it. Cognitive biases are not dissolved by intellectual awareness of their existence. But awareness creates the possibility of a check. The deliberate practice of seeking outside evaluation. Of asking not just what you think your work is worth, but what someone with no investment in it thinks it is worth. The gap between those two assessments is the IKEA effect, made visible. There is a design dimension to all of this that is worth examining because it reveals how thoroughly the IKEA effect has been understood and deliberately exploited by companies operating far beyond the furniture industry. IKEA's flat pack model is not just a cost-saving measure. It is, whether intentionally or not, a mechanism for generating customer attachment that assembled furniture cannot produce. The customer who builds the table has a relationship with the table. The customer who receives it assembled does not. The craft movement, the rise of DIY culture, the enormous popularity of cooking shows and sourdough baking and home renovation content, All of it sits in the same psychological territory. People are not just seeking products. They are seeking the experience of making. And what they are really seeking, beneath the making, is the ownership that only effort can produce. The sense of having caused something to exist. The companies that understand this are not selling objects. They are selling the experience of authorship. And the objects that come out of that experience are valued not at market rate but at the rate the customer's own labor has set. Which is, reliably and predictably, higher. The deepest implication of the IKEA effect is what it reveals about the nature of value itself. We tend to think of value as a property of objects. Something that exists in the thing, that can be measured, compared, and agreed upon by reasonable observers. But the IKEA effect, and the broader field of behavioral economics that surrounds it, points toward a different picture. Value is not in the object. Value is in the relationship between the object and the person holding it. And that relationship is shaped by history, by effort, by identity, by the stories that have accumulated around the thing. This is why two people can look at the same object, in the same condition, with full information about its material properties, and disagree fundamentally about what it is worth. They are not measuring the same thing. One person is measuring the object. The other is measuring the object plus everything they have put into it. And there is no neutral vantage point from which to say which measurement is correct. Because value was never just in the object to begin with. It was always partly in the maker. Always partly in the labor. Always partly in the story of how a thing came to exist and who caused it to exist and what it cost them. This has been the echo principle. We map the unseen blueprints of human behavior. The things you have built are worth more to you than they are to anyone else, and that gap is not a flaw in your thinking. It is a window into what value actually is. We will see you in the next one.